appalling pattern of behaviour has emerged in how Australia's energy policy gets made, thanks to some incredible scoops in Senate estimates this week. The pattern is this: announce first, figure out how it'll work later.
When was the draft design framework handed to government?
This is a simple date question that the government is desperate to avoid, because on the 7th of May, they announced a gas reservation policy. But it was on the 25th of May, the department released a draft framework for how it might actually work. Now, the truth is this framework is a sketched outline at best. It's really just a start of a consultation process to seed the questions to get feedback from industry on how it would actually work. But you think the government would have at least this kind of framework in front of them before announcing the policy? Apparently not.
The officials have taken it on notice to see whether it is in fact something that's part of the government's preparation of the government's approach.
Let's make it easier. Before or after the 7th of May?
Go draft us a consultation paper that reflects our decision. That and then go and run the consultation exercise.
Okay, so the Minister's Office received the document that was published yesterday after the budget announcement on the 7th.
Yeah, well, we couldn't draft a consultation document on a policy until the government had decided what the policy they wanted us to consult about was.
So the government has announced a decision about a gas reservation, but not even decided whether more than half of Australia's gas exporters in WA and the Northern Territory will be included. Those aren't minor details. These are policy announcements on the fly. Political decisions driven by Cabinet with the actual policy to be backfilled later on.
How on earth did the government come up with a percentage when it has no answer to any of those questions?
Well, Senator, the approach that the government's taken here was a decision of government. It was informed by our Cabinet considerations in the normal way.
A political decision, not a fact-based decision.
Nothing could do more to damage the government's negotiating position than going back to change key terms in the contract after the winners have already been announced. And it was protecting the negotiating position of the government that's always been the reason that the cost of this scheme has never been released publicly. This is bad policy, incompetently executed, with the cost shrouded in secrecy for no good reason. The government's method of policy making in energy is becoming really clear. You make big announcements first and think things through later on. That's why budgets blow out, why projects fail to be completed. This will be disastrous for the future energy system.
Yeah, and that disaster is already upon us.
This is not just a policy disagreement anymore. This is a full-scale exposure of how Australia's energy decisions are being made behind closed doors. And what we just heard in that Senate exchange raises serious questions about competence, timing, and transparency. Because when officials are asked a simple factual question, not a political opinion, not a prediction, just a basic timeline, they immediately shift into hesitation, deflection, and procedural language. And that is exactly where the problem starts. The key issue here is not whether a gas policy exists. The issue is when the government actually understood the framework of its own announcement. On one hand, the policy is announced publicly on May 7th. On the other hand, the draft framework that explains how it is supposed to function only appears much later on May 25th. And when asked directly whether the decision came before or after the framework, officials avoid giving a clear answer and fall back on process, consultation, and cabinet considerations. That is not a small detail. That is the entire foundation of policy design. Because if a government announces a major national energy decision without a clear operational framework in place, then the question becomes unavoidable. What exactly was being announced in the first place? A finished policy or just a political headline? And that is where the exchange becomes even more revealing. Instead of directly addressing the gap in timing, the response circles around internal processes, suggesting that consultation documents can only be prepared after decisions are made. But that still does not explain why the public announcement came before the structure of implementation was clearly defined. And in any serious policy environment, that sequence matters. Because once you announce a major economic intervention, especially in energy markets, gas supply, and national export systems, you are not just making a statement. You are setting expectations, shifting markets, and locking in political positions. And if those announcements are made before the technical details are ready, then you are effectively building policy in reverse. That is exactly what critics are pointing to when they describe this as announce first, figure it out later. Not as a slogan, but as a pattern. And the concern raised in this hearing is not theoretical. It is about execution risk. If key parameters like inclusion criteria, export coverage, or cost structure are still being defined after the announcement, then the stability of the entire policy starts to come into question. Because once stakeholders act on a public announcement, you cannot simply adjust the structure later without consequences. Contracts, negotiations, and market expectations are already in motion, and that is why the final warning in this exchange is so significant. It is not just criticism of one decision, it is a broader claim that this method of policymaking leads to predictable failures, cost blowouts, unfinished projects, and long-term instability in energy planning. And whether you agree or not, the core issue raised here is simple and direct. Can a government credibly manage a national energy system if the policy framework is still being written after the announcement is already made? That is the question this hearing leaves unanswered.